You made me cry. Thank you very much. I just sat, I gave up eventually, and I just sat there with tears going down my cheeks
Oh,
reading the
that's good.
stories.
I cried. I was like that writing it, I have to tell you. I mean, I managed to do pretty well through most chapters, but then at some point, inevitably, it would come that I would just remember some of the people that I talked to, and I just burst into sobs, you know. I mean, it's tremendously emotional stuff, you know.
It got to the point when I stopped thinking of it as Afghanistan and started to think of it as a small town of Canadians in Afghanistan, because they all seemed interconnected, and so many of them knew each other and were friends. And
Well, it's a small army, you know. They always say that to you, but it's true, and you realize it yourself. I mean, there were several times when, well, Nicola Goddard is a good example. I never met her, but I knew her as a sort of soothing voice on the radio. Rosie DiMano and I and two other journalists went up to Bob Robinson.
Bob being
Forward Operating Base. And this was probably meant to be an 8-hour trip, but everything small that could go wrong on this trip went wrong. We ended up spending 24 hours in the labs. She was in one and I was in the other, and when we got there, we saw each other for the first time since we started the trip, we both said sort of at the same time, who is that woman on the air? Because, you know, it was pretty frenetic at some points and scary. There was a suicide bomber who was trying to drive through the Kandahar city streets to get to our convoy, but couldn't make it because of traffic, and he kept trying other routes, and we were getting a blow-by-blow of this, you know, inside the vehicle. So it was quite freaky, and throughout it all, we could hear Nicola's voice on the air, just always calm, never sounded fretful or worried, and it kind of calmed you down, you know, made you feel you're going to be all right. And so when we got to the base, Rosie and I said, who was that woman? And we asked Bill Fletcher, and Nicola was his FOO, his forward observation officer, and he raved about her and said, you know, I wouldn't go anywhere without Nicola. That was in, oh God, when was that? That was about a month, I think, before she was killed. And then when she was killed, that was in April, I think, yeah, we both felt, Rosie and I, as though we knew her, you know, and then since then I've spoken at some length to her mom and her sister, and a little bit more recently to her dad and her husband, and her first major, so I feel like I know her. And I think the book, you say, it's like a small town. Well, the Canadian Army is like a small town. So wherever it goes, you know, there's all these people who somehow know each other, only a couple of degrees of separation.
At first when I looked at it, Canada, Afghanistan, I know what Christie's politics are like. I'm probably not going to agree with her, but you know what? It's not that.
These are the people who went there because our government sent them there. Now, whether you think that was a good decision or a bad one, it's irrelevant. I mean, they didn't have a choice. I mean, they are soldiers, and soldiers do what the government tells them to do. So you're right. It was, on my part, it was a conscious choice. I mean, as a columnist, I like to preach. I preach all the time in my column. You know, I'm sure I'm pretty shrill sometimes, and I didn't want that to mess up and interfere with the book, because the book isn't about me or my politics. The book is about the soldiers and what they do. So it was really hard, actually, to, you know, keep myself out of it. I think I have to be in there somehow because I'm a narrator, and often, you know, I can draw the connections between people and chapters. The sense that I get from a lot of my own friends is that people feel there's something vaguely kind of unseemly about war and soldiering in its truest sense, which is, of course, killing so that you are not killed. And part of the reason why I wanted to write about these guys, because I wanted people here to understand their experience, you know. I didn't want them to feel marooned or unwanted the way that Vietnam vets were felt in America in the 60s.
Regimental Sergeant Major Michael
Bob Giroud.
Bob Giroud?
Yeah.
And I remember his commanding officer,
Omar Lavoie.
Yeah, talking about him, and it was the first time that a senior officer really seemed shaken up.
Yeah. What most of us don't understand is that the workup training to go to Afghanistan is almost a year long. I think, certainly from Rotos 1 and 2 it was, and I expect I think it's almost the same now, because I know guys who are going back in February and they've been training since the summer, so actively big training. So Omar Lavoie and Robert Giroud were together for the better part of a year, off on exercise, often in Wainwright for months at a time, training. They always shared quarters, whether that was, I guess, a tent or most often, I think, hard quarters where they had a room opposite one another. They happened to get along personally, though they'd never met before their respective appointments. they have families that are with the same kind of values, and anyway, they're really nice people, and they got along tremendously well, and really admired and loved one another. And when Giroud was killed, I mean, I think it just tore the heart out of Lavo. I really do. I mean, he talks in the book. You know, he went back to his quarters, I think, that night, and, you know, there's an empty bed across the hall from him, and he couldn't wait to get away from Kandahar airfield because people there didn't know how to deal with him and his grief. And he went back out into the field with his soldiers for the first time without his RSM at his side, and just went off into a quiet place and cried, you know. But he only felt sort of comfortable doing it with his soldiers because they understood.
I have a feeling that you'd like to go back.
Oh, I'm going back.
You are?
Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah, no, I'm going back in February. Some of the people in this book from Bravo Company and others are going back. Some of the medics, some of the young medics are going back. And I feel, Rosie and I have talked about this, I think both feel an obligation. I'm sure there's lots of reporters who feel it, that as long as there are Canadian soldiers there should be Canadian reporters there writing their stories.
I was very impressed with it. Great
Oh,
job.
good. I'm glad.
Good job.
Thanks.
The book is 15 Days, Stories of Bravery, Friendship, Life and Death from Inside the New Canadian Army. And speaking with the author, columnist Christie Blatchford, and Christie Blatchford's 15 Days, published by Doubleday Canada.